would be bad and cynical and crooked enough. But what makes it not just a lie, but an incompetent and obvious lie, is that he gets the prophecy wrong. The important word here is the word virgin, which in the Hebrew is rendered simply as Alma, a word which, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the Oxford Hebrew Lexicon, and the Oxford Companion to the Bible, simply signifies a young woman, unmarried as well as married, and thus carries no implication of virginity. However, the author of Matthew apparently couldn't read Hebrew, and was going by the Greek translation, which renders Alma as Parthenos, or virgin. And from this we get the virgin birth, the belief that Jesus was the biological Son of God, the idea that Jesus was of the same substance as the Father, and to a large degree the Trinity. Now, we are faced with two possibilities here. Either, and this is my position, the whole story of the virgin birth and all that follows is simply a cynical cock-up, of the kind one might expect from a wholly man-made work of fiction. The only other possible explanation is that God's Hebrew is not quite as good as you might have expected. Now, in a couple of minutes, Ray will have the floor, and he is perfectly free to present any evidence he might have as to why this obvious and egregious error is not so. He is free to present any arguments he has as to how he can still believe that the Bible is the inerrant and perfect Word of God, in spite of this obvious error. But I'm pretty sure he won't come up with anything, on the simple grounds that Christendom has had 2,000 years to come up with a counter-argument, and so far hasn't come up with anything better than no it isn't, tain't so, and in the good old days, burn, heretic, burn. Instead, Ray will turn to the glories of creation and argue that the wonders of the world testify to the existence of God. Now, this argument seems well, but it has a long history and an equally long list of problems. The first and most obvious problem being that absolutely every religion ever invented has claimed exactly the same thing. And as such, even if Ray were to be able to prove that the earth had been created by God, he would still have all his work in front of him if he wanted to prove that it had been invented by his God. The second and far bigger problem is that creation is a good deal less glorious than people want to believe. And the best quote on this comes from David Attenborough, who was recently voted the most respected man in Britain, and has spent the last 50 years often neck deep in the glories of creation. And he stated, when creationists talk about God creating every individual species as a separate act, they always speak of hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers or other beautiful things. But personally, I tend to think of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in West Africa, a worm that is going to make him blind. And I ask, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you say is all-merciful, who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that this God created a worm that can live no other way other than in an innocent child's eyeball? Now, I'm sure Ray will reply, as Christians always have, that this isn't God's fault, that God created man perfect, and man lived in a perfect world without suffering, and that it was only after Adam and Eve rebelled against God that sin came into the world and death and misery came along with it. He will say that God cursed the earth because of Adam's transgression, and that disease and cruelty and suffering and death were worse. He will claim that sin and suffering cannot be separated, that we suffer because we live in a fallen creation, and that one day all will be right. But personally, I think we should take a minute to consider God's behaviour of the fall. For God to have purposely unleashed every form of evil and suffering onto the earth, including the inevitability of death, especially given that he is meant to have been omnipotent and therefore to have known the harvest before he did it, would have made God, and would make God, the worst genocidal, bullying, murdering tyrant in the history of the universe.
Woo!
If we shudder at the names and memories of Hitler and Stalin, who between them killed tens of millions, how can any person with even the most rudimentary sense of morality claim that we should fall down in pathetic and toad-eating supplication to a being directly culpable for the death of every person who has ever died and ever will die? Silence. Now, of course, the official Christian line, and the one I expect Ray to take, is that God is being cruel only to be kind, and that he's beset us with these innumerable sufferings, only to show us the error of our ways, and to bring us back to him. But this, again, is servile, spit-licking masochism of the worst kind. And what is worse, it is masochism offered to us by a sadist. If you are unable to see this, I would ask you to imagine that you are sitting on the trial of a man charged with beating his wife, torturing his children, infecting one of his daughters with HIV, another with drug-resistant tuberculosis, and of inflicting a third with an obstetric fistula. And if you don't know what that is, look it up, and if that doesn't destroy your faith, nothing will. Now, imagine that he proudly admits that he did these things. How likely, and I'd like a show of hands for this, how likely are any of you to be impressed by his claim that this is proof of his holiness? Are you picking your nose or raising your hand? Okay, no one. Okay, now imagine that he goes a step further, and in his defense says that while he did do these things, he only did them because he loved his family so much and cared so deeply for them that he had no choice but to punish their wickedness in order that they might share in his holiness. A show of hands, who would be impressed by that? No, it isn't. And I'll tell you why. If we are to reject such a claim by a fallible human being who may very possibly have sincerely held but horrible beliefs about love and family, how can we possibly accept this from a creature who claims to be the very wellspring of morality? However, there is an even deeper problem here, and it is a problem that has plagued the greatest minds in theology for much of the last 2,000 years. They have tried and failed to come up with an answer. The unavoidable conclusion, if you take the Genesis story literally, is that Adam and Eve were so made that they could not help but have fallen. This argument has a long history, and the 16th century playwright Fulk Rebel put it best when he wrote in his play Mustafa, "O wearisome condition of humanity." I'll actually start this again because it's important. "O wearisome condition of humanity, born under one law to another bound, vainly begot and yet forbidden vanity, created sick and commanded to be sound." And this is exactly the point. Even on its own terms, a literal reading of the creation story makes it clear that God created humans sick and then punished them for not being well. We see this clearly when we consider that Adam and Eve could not possibly have made a moral choice either way about the eating of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil until they had already made the choice, by which point they are punished for their failure to make a moral choice. As theologian William Eagleton put it, this is the paradox of the fall. To have fallen, mankind must have been morally irresponsible, meaning it must have had knowledge of good and evil. And yet, to have such knowledge, to really know what evil is and how it is different from good, mankind must have already fallen. Now, Christians usually argue that this is wrong and that Adam and Eve were punished not for their failure to make a moral choice, but for their disobedience. But this just rephrases the question. As firstly, how could they have known that disobedience was wrong without a sense of morality? And secondly, since according to the story there was no sin until after they had sinned, when they sinned, or at the time of the alleged crime, they were absolutely and utterly and completely as God made them. And whatever it was God was punishing them for, be it rebellion or blasphemy, or which seems most likely that God was threatened by the possibility that humans might become godlike, were actually facets of human nature built in by God. Was that the 5-minute bell? Okay. Now, of course, Christians tend not to be interested in the morality of the story, as this man demonstrated. They feel that we are not able to judge God's morality, that the old "what complaint can a pot have against the potter?" And they will simply move on to, I suspect, given these little cards that are on your seat, that Ray is going to move on to simply argue that creation and God must be true because evolution doesn't work.